Our next auspicious speaker today is from the Rainbow Center. We have J.C. Pankratz. I refer to J.C. as Jesus. And she's at the Rainbow Center. She's in charge of the Crime Victims Advocacy Program and in charge of volunteer coordination and crisis intervention. She comes from, I believe it's Indiana, is that right?
It is true.
Yes, it's true. And what brought her here is the AmeriCorps. So she was involved with Habitat for Humanity outside of in Tacoma and Pierce County, and also the Women's Crisis Support Team. So we are really lucky to have her, and she's going to teach us about cultural competency. So as David had alluded to, for all the people who are volunteering at the Rainbow Center, Q Law, Tacoma, Pierce County Volunteer Legal Services Clinic, you have to be culturally competent. She's going to teach us about this. Thanks, JC.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. How are you today? Good? Awesome. Can everybody hear me? Is this an appropriate distance? Great. So as Dominique said, my name is JC. I'm the advocate for victims of crime at the Rainbow Center here in Tacoma. And I'm here to talk to you today about cultural competency. I hope today to talk to you about kind of what I do, about what the Rainbow Center does, and maybe how we can be of service to you, as well as some different, kind of like the core purpose of today and what we need to carry through for this conversation. And then we'll get into some really meaty stuff about different language, different practices, and that kind of thing. What I would definitely encourage is if you ever have a question at any point during this, to raise your hand and we'll talk about it. I really love questions. They help me greatly. So we can definitely do that. So the Rainbow Center, founded in 1997 by volunteers. We are a community organization that serves the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, and allied community here. We were founded by volunteers. We were actually out of the United Way building on Pacific Avenue. We were a desk and a phone in a very small closet-like room. And then as we grew and got funding and staff and things like that, we eventually came out of the closet. It's my one joke. It went over well. Wonderful. We came out of the closet and we moved to several locations, but are now, hopefully, for a long time, located at 2215 Pacific Avenue with Oasis Youth Center. We fulfill a great deal of roles for the community. We say that the tenets of our mission are education, advocacy, and celebration. So a big portion of that education piece is doing things like this. So myself, Michelle Douglas, our executive director, and our partners at Oasis Youth Center, we train people all over Tacoma, Pierce County, and in Seattle as well. Guidance counselors, advocacy groups, now attorneys, we can add that to the list as well, but all sorts of businesses, right? Anybody who's coming into contact with this community who needs some education. We also do crime victims advocacy. What I have really found since I've started working at the Rainbow Center is that we are really a gateway to resources. People come to us first, sometimes before they even call the police, right? They come because they're like, this has happened to me and I don't know what to do, and I need somebody who will sit with me and lay out all of my options and work with me for where I can go, where I will be treated with dignity and respect. Because that's something that our community has learned very well, is that not all doors are open to them, right? So they come to us first. And so we are part of the Crime Victim Advocacy Program through the state, along with several other partners around the community, like the Tacoma Community House is another one. So we're working with people one-on-one who have been victims of crime. We practice strengths-based advocacy, so we work with people to find out what their natural resources are and what we can use to help improve their quality of life or navigate whatever situation they're in. And most of all, we accompany them to through different processes and navigating different systems. You all know very well that criminal justice, law enforcement, that thing is a very complicated system. And it's really nice for people who have never navigated that before to kind of have someone at their side whose job is to be like, you're okay and you're right, and we're going to keep going through this. David talked about the discrimination process of filing through the city of Tacoma for housing and employment, I believe. I cited him for that part. So I've worked with 4 different people through those processes, so 2 through housing and 2 through employment discrimination, and those processes are all still going on. because they're long and hard, and people need somebody, especially marginalized people, need somebody with them to be like, it's okay, the bureaucracy is taking a super long time, but you're still correct, your complaints and what happened to you is still really valid, and I'm here to like validate that for you. And then we also do things like the Tacoma Pride Festival and other events in the community to kind of celebrate who we are. But that's us. Everybody got a little card that looks like this. It has our hours and our information on it. And we really, I mean, there's literally nothing I love more than when like therapists or anybody calls me and is like, I have someone and I need to talk to you about the best way to proceed forward. We're there for technical assistance, right? That's really a great use of our resources. There are 3 things that as we get into this cultural competency piece that I want us to think about. The first one that we usually talk about is called intent versus impact, which is a concept that many of you may already be familiar with. But how many of you have ever said something to someone that hurt them or was offensive? I always raise both hands because I've done this many times. How many of you have had something like that said to you? Also, I will raise both hands, right? Because of your identity or any other part of who you are. In those situations, how many of you have experienced something where somebody apologized and didn't really apologize? Like their apology was like, I'm sorry that you felt that way after I said that. We have this really big movement now, I think, where we place a lot of emphasis on what we intended to do when we opened our mouths, right? When I said that to you, I really meant it in a good way. I never meant to hurt you, so I'm not at fault, right? What we don't acknowledge is the kind of impact that has on people who hear those questions or hear those kinds of things every day, no matter how small. And so what we move to do, because in this work, you will make mistakes. I make mistakes every day. That's always like I usually have a training partner, and his name is Matthew, and we are always like, we make mistakes every day, because we do. And what's important is you apologize for your impact and move on, right? And not try to minimize. It's I think it's a very human thing that we're like, oh, but I didn't mean to hurt you, and I feel really bad, so I'm sorry. Being like, what I said really hurt you. I'm sorry. How do we move on so that I don't do it again? So thinking about that. The second thing is called curiosity versus necessity, and I think, especially because today we're going to be talking a lot about the transgender community, this is something that's really impactful for people, is curiosity versus necessity. The basis of this is when we ask a question or say something, are we saying it because we need to know or because we want to know? And this is something that trans people in particular face. I've never met someone who hasn't faced this, where inappropriate questions like, so what's going on down there? What's your genitalia like? Lots of questions that humans don't ask other humans, right? There's no need for us to ask those kinds of questions. But sometimes when we meet someone who identifies in a way that we've never seen before, or perhaps we've only seen on Jerry Springer or Maury, we get possessed by this very human thing to be like, I have to know everything about them. I have to ask all these questions. And we don't think about that we need to ask instead of everything that we really want to know. It's kind of part of that do your research piece that David was talking about. Instead of asking questions that we just need to know, right? Things we wouldn't ask other people. But what we do is we see someone who is different and we decide that it's time to interrogate them about who they are, so that we know. And that's not okay. And then the last piece is what we call thoughtfulness and understanding. So you may follow those first 2 things like totally perfectly. Like you may always acknowledge your impact, you may only ask questions that you need to know, or become really good at asking questions in a way that's like thoughtful and humanizing. And the reaction from a person may not be what you want. We have to remember that like these communities carry a ton of history, a ton of history of being shut out of institutions, of not being listened to, of not being seen or acknowledged. And so we've learned like survival techniques and things like that where we push people away and we make people really earn our trust. So being understanding of that and having the patience to continue working with people. So those are the 3 things that I kind of want to pull with us today as we move forward. Are there any questions about those? Awesome. Great. So I have passed out a handout, or actually Dominique did it. I didn't mean to take credit for that, Dominique. Your hard work passing this out. It looks like this, and it's a list of some vocabulary. What's really important for this community is that we use the right language about things. And when I talk about a lot of these issues, I am not a spokesperson for the community. What I'm sharing is my working knowledge from working with lots of people. There are things I don't know. There are words on here that you're like, I've never heard that used before, or I don't like that word, things like that. And we can definitely talk about that because this is intended to be kind of that like ground level education so that we all have a common language with how to speak about some of these issues. So what I usually do is we like popcorn this and we kind of do it interactively together, but many of you are still eating, and I feel like that might be unnecessarily cruel to make you eat and talk at the same time. So I'm going to go through some of this, and then I'll check in with you, and we'll see if we can transition to a more engaging way of doing this. But the first three things I want to talk about are gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation. The thing is, too, is that you may know a lot of this information already, right? You may have educated yourself, done some research, but it's good to also have some common language if you need to explain these concepts to other people. Like if in your role you also need to become an educator for something or other. And gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation are three things that get conflated frequently. I've seen this a lot with schools, like teachers or administrators will conflate these, who will be like, a child will come out as trans and they'll be like, well, they're gay, and so this can't happen and this can't happen, when like there's not an understanding that these three things are sometimes connected and sometimes not, but they're three different parts of someone's identity. So the first one that people are usually most familiar with is sexual orientation, and that's defined here as a term describing a person's emotional, romantic, and sexual attraction, whether it is for members of the same sex or a different sex. More appropriate than sexual preference, a person's sexual orientation may or may not dictate the person's sexual behavior or actions. Language, again, super important. Use the word sexual orientation and not preference. Like, I prefer one mustard over another. That's not an identity, right? Use the word sexual orientation, not preference, which implies that it is a choice. This is usually what people are most familiar with. There are more terms now that kind of separate out emotional attraction, romantic attraction, and sexual attraction. For the purposes of this definition, they're all kind of connected together, but some people identify these things differently. And then gender identity and gender expression. Gender identity is a person's internal, deeply felt sense of being male, female, or something else, something in between, anywhere, and everybody has one. And then gender expression is the expression of that gender identity, and that can be through many different things. An easy way for people to begin to understand it is like dress and hairstyle, clothes, that kind of thing. But it can be how you walk, how you talk, how you move. All these different things can comprise your gender expression. So gender identity is who you are, right? Sexual orientation is who you love, maybe your emotional, romantic, and sexual attraction. And then gender expression is how you express that. Usually I do kind of like a dance, so you get lunch and a show. Da, 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 da. But yeah, do all those three things make sense? We feel like we have clear definitions for what those are. And the thing is that these things do not determine one another. With some people, they're very deeply connected, but it's very dangerous to assume that they are, right? That just because someone's gender expression is one way, that their sexual orientation is this, or their gender identity is this, right? Or any combination of those things. Because we are vibrant and a beautifully complicated community, because that's what being human is. So everyone is different. So those three things, those are important. I find that especially when I work with parents, so if I'm working like a parent, we get a lot of like calls from like freaked out parents at the Rainbow Center, parents of 7-year-olds and like 70-year-olds who are like, my child's coming out, I don't know what to do. And this is like a very important, distinct thing to talk to them about. The thing is that everybody has a gender expression, a gender identity, a sexual orientation, not just LGBTQ people. Which is sometimes like a huge revelation. I was working with this one lady and we were talking about it, and she was like, JC, I have a gender expression. And I was like, you do, girl, it's awesome. She's like, there are things that I like to do and all these things. And they're not always things we consider feminine. I was like, yeah, like it was great. Anyway, it was a great experience for me. But yeah, everybody has one. And so talking about those things is important. The next handful of terms I'd like to talk about are on the back page. And this is going to kind of get into the meat of when we're talking about working with transgender individuals. So there are 4 terms on the back: transgender, transition, transphobia, and transsexual. And some of those terms are on there because we need to talk about maybe why not to use them. But we're going to tackle transgender first. Transgender is an umbrella term that can be used to describe people whose gender expression is non-conforming and or whose gender identity is different from their assigned sex at birth. This term can include transsexuals, genderqueers, cross-dressers, and others whose gender expression varies from traditional gender norms. This is often the preferred term as opposed to transsexual. The definition for transsexual is at the bottom. This is a term I think that we used to hear a lot and we don't really hear anymore, and I usually advise people to lead with the word transgender. There are some people who identify as transsexual. They typically are older. And they sometimes use it to signify that they've gone through certain medical processes. Sometimes it's hormones or surgery or anything. But we really, like the word transgender is much more warmly received. And I just think is a much better word to use. The rule is like, whatever someone identifies as, we go with that, right? No matter what it is. But you will, using the word transgender or trans, much better word. A word that's not on here that probably should be is cisgender. Has anybody heard that word before? Well, you all have. Wonderful. And cisgender just means not transgender, right? How we describe someone whose gender identity and their assigned sex at birth are the same, right? Using the phrase assigned sex at birth is a great way to talk about this. The other trick with this community, it's not a trick, but I guess it's like an ever-evolving challenge, is that language is always changing, and what phrases we use and what's accepted sometimes changes on the daily basis. But for the most part, saying assigned sex at birth is the most true way we can talk about how that happens, as opposed to your biological sex or your physiological sex, but saying the assigned sex at birth is when a doctor looked at you, this is what they assigned. And that is kind of the good language to use to talk about it. Transition, the time period when a transgender person starts living as the gender he or she identifies as, often includes a change in style of dress, selection of a new name, a request that people use the correct pronouns, and possibly hormone therapy and or surgery. So I have a lot to say about this word. So transition, or about struggles during transitioning. So transitioning is extremely expensive, right? So to get your name changed is the easiest thing to do. I know David was talking a little bit about that. It's the easiest thing to do. It's also the most expensive thing to do, and it's very hard to get information on how to do it. I recently worked with somebody through the process. There is an organization in Tacoma called Gender Alliance of the South Sound, and they're able to help reimburse people for name changes because they're so expensive. And working with them, I had always been under the impression that there is the standard price, which is $183, and then you can get it lowered to $90 if you're low income. If you fill out a certain form, which you have to file the name petition online, but you can't fill out that form online. You have to go to the courthouse and get it. But I got one while I was there, so I can make copies of it. So that was good. But you really get the runaround while you're doing it. And then we went, and I went there to help her out with it, and it turns out that we went before the judge. The judge asked all those questions, like David said, they have to ask are you doing this to evade taxes and stuff like that. So she was prepared to answer those questions, and then the judge just waived the fee. It was great, but there's no information, and I got the distinct impression that that it's a judge by judge thing, that there are other judges who would have been oh, so you owe $60, and then she would have been there's no standardization of the process. And she was a person who, when she filled out her income form, she has no job, and she's living with her parents, so she has zeros literally down the form, which makes sense. But if somebody has TANF, like how much, it's really up in the air, like how much a judge is going to say, like, this is how much you owe, this is how much you, this is how much we're going to make you pay. They also do it in the middle of traffic court, which is weird, but I guess it all works. We used to sit there for like an hour or 2 hours and like listen to people talk about that. And then at the end, they're just like, okay, let's do the name changes really quick. For the most part, it is, at least in my experience with this person and talking to people who've done it, it's the most painless process. But something that happens continually, so like if you're going to go get your gender marker changed on your driver's license or Social Security, there are a lot of things that go into play with that. To get your gender marker changed on your driver's license, you have to get a letter from a doctor, which is hard because it is super difficult. Trans people, sorry, I'm talking about a lot of different things right now. There's a great study that came out called Injustice at Every Turn, which I would definitely advise everybody to take a look at. They have like a super slim 2-page version, and then they have like an 80-page like amazing version, so you can pick which version you want to read. But it was a survey about 5 years ago of about 7,000 gender diverse and transgender identified individuals who took this survey about their life experiences, and it measures it gives you really clear, excellent numbers about the rates of trans people who are able to go and seek preventative care, so care before they're sick, which is only something like 20% of trans identified individuals do that, right? See a doctor regularly, or where they are physically, sexually, and emotionally assaulted in different public places. So basically, if you want to get this little letter changed on your driver's license, you have to find a primary care provider who will see you on your insurance, which if you have Medicaid is great, but if you have to wait 2 months to get that appointment at the community health care clinic or at CMAR, that takes a lot of time. You have to hope that when you get there, the receptionist treats you the way you want to be treated, that the nurse treats you the way you want to be treated, that the other people waiting in the waiting room treat you the way you want to be treated, and all these people, before you even get to the doctor who sees you for 10 minutes, treat you with dignity and respect. And that overwhelmingly is not the case for our people, for a lot of reasons that, because maybe you have changed your name and you are requesting that people call you by the pronouns you identify as, but you don't have the money to dress that way. You don't have the money to start hormones. And so the way you look causes a stir with people, right? They're like, you don't look like a girl. So why would I call you what you want to be called, right? I've worked with people, trans men, who still need gynecological exams, who call their gynecologist's office, and the person on the other end of the line is like, so what are you going to wear when you get here? If you dress like a guy, we don't want you here, right? It's ridiculous, right? And it's ridiculous that these basic human rights that everybody needs are denied because there's so many steps to get to before you meet with this one person who can help you. Medical care that you need, or to get your driver's license changed, right? There are lots of people who, because their documents don't match who they are, they're discriminated against in job interviews, they're discriminated against when they're looking for apartments because they have to put one thing down on the piece of paper and then they walk in and it's a different story all of a sudden. So it's really complicated. And then when you get to, we have a person, they have made it into the doctor's office, right? They've finally, they've navigated this, they've waited 2 months for their appointment, and then they sit in the doctor's office and this is the first time they've met them. And the doctor says, I think that before I fill out this form to get this little letter changed on your driver's license, I think you need to go see a therapist, and then I'll fill out the form for you, right? Or they go, I need to see you a few more times. And it's just the longest, most ridiculous process for somebody to just get this one thing changed. The point of all that was to just say, so trans people receive an incredible amount of harassment based on the fact that their identity documents don't match who they are, because it's a long, complicated, and expensive process. And then people frequently use that as ways to undermine someone's identity. So I was working with parents once, and they were like, well, our kid came out to us as trans. He's transitioning right now. But he hasn't gotten his driver's license changed, so I don't think that he's really serious about it. And it was like, no, we needed to sit and explain what all these little pieces that go into this are. And I think it's really important for you to know this, because sometimes we, if we haven't gone through that process ourselves, there are all these little invisibilities that we don't know about that are suddenly right there. All these little struggles. When David was here, he was talking about like, don't think that you understand what everybody's resources are. I felt like that was something he said about like, maybe they don't have an email address, maybe they need help writing a letter, things like that. The point is that there are many, many hidden hurdles for this community, and it's an education in of itself going through it with someone if you're trying to navigate that system. And then a lot of people are just like, well, I'm not gonna bother with it because why? I don't have the money or the time. But yeah. In transitioning, David talked about the YMCA of Pierce and Kitsap and the policy that's happening right now. The Rainbow Center is really involved in that. There was a large community meeting earlier this week where lots of people came together to talk about this policy. And something really important that I thought was said, somebody who stood up and was like, what the word transition means and the way it's used in this policy are totally different things, and the way it's used in this policy is dangerous, right? To say that like how we're going to determine who's in transition and who's not, and how that, you know, empowers people to make judgments or almost be like a gender police of somebody else. It's really dangerous for people. Transitioning is a long, complicated, expensive process. I guess that would be like the very bottom line of that like 8 million paragraph thing that I just sort of vomited out at you. Is a long, expensive process. People need a lot of assistance through it, both monetary and emotionally. There are community support groups that exist for people, mostly because going through this process takes a lot out of you. And what's, I think, super important for you to know is to do that research and to be educated about these processes. As people are going through this, especially the medical side of things, a danger that we kind of are running into is, so like now we have a lot more access to all this stuff, right? Medicaid covers things, there's more health insurance, people are more able to go to a doctor and see someone. But a doctor doesn't have to have any training in transcultural competency or on trans health to treat a trans person, right? So I was working with somebody last week who had been on testosterone for several months. And then as a side effect of testosterone, your red blood cell count goes up. And so his endocrinologist saw that and just like immediately stopped, was like, I will give you no more. And then he went into such, because he was on a lot of it, right? Like he went through withdrawal, like hormonal withdrawal, which is a super intense process, and like thought about hurting himself and things like that, had to check himself into an emergency room, because the depression and like the mood swings were so bad that he felt like something bad was going to happen to him. And I was talking to him and I was like, do you think that your endocrinologist or your primary care provider, do they understand that like how necessary this is to you? Do you think that they have a complete picture of this? And he was like, I really don't think so. I think that they think that like it's just something that like, well, if they take it away, I'll figure out a way to deal with it. And that's just not true. That's not a reality for this community. So educating yourself and making sure that like you know what you're talking about, so someone who's already going through something who comes to you does not have to take on that burden, which is then what we had to talk about. Like, how do you talk to your doctor and convince them that this actually is really important in a way that they understand? Transphobia is fear, hatred of, aversion to, or discrimination against transgender people or people who are gender nonconforming. It's a great way to just sort of describe like general things like that YMCA policy, other things where we are afraid, or that's just kind of like systematic blocking of trans people for services. That's also a way that transphobia manifests itself. It's not so much like my training partner is always like, it's not like you're in the bathtub shaking and going, I'm afraid of trans people, which maybe it is, I don't know. But yeah, that encompasses a lot of those barriers that people are running into. And then the last term on there is transsexual, which we kind of touched on, but a term for someone who transitions from one physical sex to another in order to bring his or her body more in line with his or her innate sense of gender identity. It includes those who were born male, but whose gender identity is female, or those who were born female, or whose gender identity is male, as well as people who may not clearly identify as either male or female. Transsexual people have the same range of gender identities and gender expressions as non-transsexual people. Many transsexual people refer to themselves as transgender. It's a good term to know. It's a good distinction to kind of understand if somebody is like, I identify as transsexual, not transgender. But most of the time, there's a real big movement towards using the word transgender. So, are any questions about any of that so far? Any questions about like working with someone and going through any of those processes? Great. Something that is important to do, and that David also touched on, is about not assuming people's pronouns. Has anybody asked for someone's pronouns before? Great. When we ask people to start integrating this into their practices, so like we work with lots of advocates, and they're like, that's so awkward, like how do I ask somebody that? I've never asked someone that before. And it is, and it takes practice, so some of you have probably had lots of practice doing it. What I always find works best is to start with myself. So I say, hi, I'm JC. I like she, her, hers pronouns. What pronouns do you prefer? What's your name, right? What do you like? By starting with yourself, it really helps like give an example and bridge that connection. Also, sometimes when I ask people that, they're like, what's a pronoun? And I'm like, and so there's that piece of education too. And then just being open to whatever pronoun someone uses. And then continuing to use that. And if you mess up on pronouns, it happens. You apologize and correct yourself and move on. What's important is that like you actually correct yourself. It's not okay if you misgender someone or use the wrong pronoun every time you speak with them, and don't make the effort to correct yourself. It is hard. Like nobody ever sat me down when I was growing up and been like, JC, people have pronouns that aren't he and she. We have a multiplicity of genders in the world, right? Like how much easier would life be now if we had had that kind of knowledge growing up? But we didn't. Kids are great at this though. They totally have it for the most part. But yeah, use yourself if you're anxious about asking people about their pronouns. And ask everybody, right? Only asking people who you can't tell really reinforces that like you're different from everybody else. It's much better to just start asking everybody, and then you get more practice that way, which is helpful. I want to pause and see if anybody has questions, and also wanted to check and see how much time I have left. 45 minutes? Yeah. Okay. Oh, I thought it was just an hour. Okay, cool. I guess so like what would help me is if there are specific things I haven't talked about yet with the trans community or any parts of the community that you're curious about. If you're interested, as an advocate and as the Rainbow Center, I frequently think of us as like first responders. So they're the people who come to us first before they get to you. What kind of things people are dealing with, what kind of populations that we're serving. I can talk about all of that. So right now we are working with lots of people in the, as is our mantra since marriage equality became a thing, the work continues and increases. We are working frequently with lots of people who identify as homeless. The housing situation in Pierce County is changing intensely, which is making it much harder for people to stay in shelters for a long period of time. So working with people to find safe housing is a big thing. And also because so many of these things are more available now, like people who need name changes, who are facing discrimination and because of their housing or through their employment. That's something we hear a lot. How do I deal with harassment at work? How do I come out at work? We do a lot of coaching around that too. And for the most part, people who are also who are dealing with immigration issues. We have a couple of people right now who we are working with who are trying to figure out how to apply for asylum here because they're here and they were fleeing violence because of their sexual orientation in another country. So that's another thing. What we have really seen in the past couple of years is that there's kind of a great migration happening now to Washington for LGBTQ folks because we have the good Medicaid, we have the really good Medicaid, we have really good HIV care here, and in general, Washington is perceived as a much more accepting place, at least Western Washington is. So I hope that they make it over the mountains and make it all the way here on the Washington Trail. But so we are seeing lots more people move here, which is great. And then also it's hard because it kind of works in the reverse too. Many people other places don't have the same rights that they do here. And so educating people about what their rights are is important. So lots of people are like, my landlord is trying to raise my rent because they know that I'm queer and they're not raising anybody else's. And it's like, that's actually illegal here. They can't do that. And it's like, oh my God, that's not illegal in other places, right? Which is great. Or they come from places, at least here, so like in the city of Tacoma and in Washington as well, you see that the protections stack. So it's not like you're just protected in the city of Tacoma, you're also protected in Washington itself. Whereas in other places like maybe the city of Indianapolis, you're protected, but in the state of Indiana, you're not. And so there's a lot of complicated things that people have had to keep track of. And here, life is easier, but they don't know it's easier until they know, right? Until they know what they know, which is important. So that's another thing that we work on is helping people getting reestablished with their rights here. What else would you like? Yes, please.
What are the legal issues that you're seeing that we can help out with, like we should be aware of in a clinic center?
The question was, what are the legal issues that we're seeing at the Rainbow Center? Great, and what you would want help with? Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of it, that's a great question. Immigration is a big thing. I would say things that we don't have access to. People who are family law type things as well. People who are equipped to work with people who are in diverse family situations and who are also LGBTQ. We see that frequently if a couple is splitting up and one parent identifies and the other doesn't, that like even if things were okay before that splitting, all of a sudden that becomes a weapon, right, to get custody of the kid or kids, that kind of thing. So family law type stuff. Navigating, trying to hold health insurance accountable is a really big thing. A great resource, so if you really like to learn, there is a great conference that happens every year called Gender Odyssey, and they have a professionals track that's 2 days. They have one for adults and one, or like everybody goes to all of them, but one is about trans adults and one is about trans youth issues. And if you go to that, it's great because it really gives you a medical vocabulary to know what people are talking about when they're like, oh, like puberty blockers, what's that? What do they do? What's the controversy around them? What are the myths? What are the legends? And so that you have a good knowledge of that when you talk about it. So that's, I recommend that. But I sat, and I went this year and I sat with like lots of rooms full of doctors and like how to document on health insurance claims, like what code you use and like how to like make your health insurance and like which health insurances will do some codes and which ones won't. Like it's an incredibly complicated situation. And if you don't have a doctor that's like well versed in trans issues or knows what to do, then all of a sudden it's like, well, they said no. And that's it. There's no way to like hold anybody accountable. That's what we really see a lot is like, so we have all these paths to access these things, right, that we didn't have before. But when somebody says no, we don't know what to do. So really, sometimes it's just like writing a letter, being able to talk to somebody about what their options are seems to be really important. Medical stuff especially, I would say that seems to be a big thing. But yeah, thank you for your question. Are there any other questions? Awesome. I think to kind of wrap up, this sheet that you have is a great thing to like keep with you if you are, if somebody identifies or uses a word that you don't know, you can check this out. Let me check my dictionary and see if it's in here. But also, like, again, like, we are available for you. I like can't stress that enough. We frequently get calls from people who need some technical assistance or are helping somebody but know that like they also need like some social opportunities or some mental health assistance or all these other parts of the whole that you can be used to help people. So we are there for you. And also if you were like, I had an interaction with someone and it didn't go the way that I thought it would, and I thought that I did really well, right? I thought that I was like thoughtful of my impact and I was only asking questions that were necessary, things like that. And you're like, well, it still didn't go well. We're there for you to debrief and to talk about what can go well in the future. There's a lot of memory in this community, which can sometimes make it hard to trust people in authority, like attorneys or anybody in the criminal justice system. But it's a resource that's really sorely needed. And so it's really great that you're all in here learning. Yeah. Anything else from anyone? Okay, great. Thank you for having me today.